My name is Zuri, I'm 67, and the moment my name vanished from the airport screen, I knew something was wrong. The people I trusted most boarded without me. No goodbye. No answer. Just silence. I was stranded, and that was only the beginning. Tell me where you're watching from in the comments, and subscribe for more stories about family drama, quiet revenge, and emotional courage. The screen changed without warning. 1 second, my name sat there in calm white letters. The next, it was gone. Not crossed out. Not delayed. Just missing. I blinked, leaned closer, and felt a cold pinch behind my eyes. The final boarding call echoed through the gate, sharp and final, like a door slamming in a hallway. I stood there with my purse on my shoulder and my ticket in my hand, waiting for someone to laugh and say it was a mistake. No one did. I turned toward the row of seats where we had been sitting together. Empty. Every one of them. The coffee cup I'd bought for myself still rested under the chair, untouched. I hadn't even taken a sip. That small detail hurt more than it should have. It felt like proof. Proof that I'd been rushed. Proof that I'd trusted the wrong moment. I reached for my phone. My fingers shook as I unlocked it. I called once. Straight to voicemail. I called again. Slower this time, like patience might change the outcome. Nothing. The ringing stopped too fast. My heart started to thump in a way I didn't like. Not fast. Heavy. Each beat felt like it had weight. A woman with a rolling bag brushed past me, apologizing without looking. A child laughed somewhere behind me. The airport kept breathing while I struggled to take a full breath myself. I stood there longer than made sense, staring at the gate door, half expecting it to open again, just for me. It didn't. I walked up to the counter, careful with my steps, like the floor might tilt. The gate agent was already stacking papers, her voice tired but kind. I said my name. I said it clearly. She typed, frowned, and looked back up with a soft shake of her head. "I'm sorry, ma'am," she said. "The flight is closed." I asked if there had been a mistake. I asked if they could reopen the door. I asked if my party was still on board. Each question felt smaller than the last. She answered gently, but firmly. The plane was full. The door was sealed. The system showed I hadn't boarded. I wanted to say I had been right there. I wanted to say I trusted people who said they'd wait. Instead, I nodded. My mouth wouldn't cooperate. I thanked her, because that's what I've always done when I don't know what else to say. I stepped aside and leaned against the wall near the window. Outside, the plane pulled back slow and steady. I watched it move like it was thinking things over, like it might stop. It didn't. It turned and rolled away, carrying my people with it. That was the moment it settled in. Not panic, not anger. A quiet understanding. They hadn't lost me. They'd left me. I thought back to the restroom line, how I'd said, "Go ahead, I'll be quick." I remembered the look that passed between them, too fast to catch at the time, too clear now. I brushed it off because that's what I do. I give the benefit of the doubt. I smooth over rough edges. I tell myself I'm imagining things. The airport lighting felt harsh suddenly, too bright. Every sound seemed closer. A suitcase wheel rattled over a crack in the floor. A loudspeaker crackled with another announcement that had nothing to do with me. I checked my phone again. Still nothing. No missed calls. No messages. Not even a short text to say sorry. I sat down slowly, afraid my legs might give out if I didn't. My purse rested on my lap, heavier than usual. Inside were things that felt useless now. Lip balm, tissues, a folded list of medications. Ordinary items for an ordinary trip that had just turned into something else entirely. A man across from me cleared his throat and looked away quickly, like he'd seen my face and understood enough to mind his business. I appreciated that. I wasn't ready to be seen. I stared at my hands instead. The skin looked thinner than it used to, veins more visible. I wondered when I'd started trusting people more than my own instincts. I tried one more call. This time I left a message. My voice sounded calm, which surprised me. I said I was still at the gate. I said the door had closed. I asked what had happened. I didn't accuse. I didn't cry. I ended the message with, "Please call me back." Polite to the end. When I hung up, a memory surfaced. An offhand comment made days earlier, brushed aside at the time. A suggestion that maybe I should take a later flight, that it might be easier for everyone. I'd laughed it off, said we'd stick together. Together. The word felt thin now. I stood again and paced a few steps, then stopped. I didn't want to draw attention, but staying still felt worse. My thoughts bumped into each other. Had I misunderstood? Had there been confusion? Or had this been planned in quiet pieces I hadn't noticed? A gate agent from another flight glanced at me, then at the empty seats, then back at me. "Are you okay, honey?" she asked. I nodded again. It was becoming a habit. "Just missed my flight," I said. She smiled in that way people do, when they don't believe the whole story but don't press. "Happens," she said, and turned back to her work. I knew then that whatever this was, it was mine alone to handle. No one was rushing over to fix it. No one was waving from behind the glass, calling my name. The truth landed softly, but firmly. I had been removed from the plan. I gathered my things and walked away from the gate. Each step felt like a small decision. I passed the gift shop, where I'd almost bought a magazine. I passed the restroom, where I'd tried to hurry. I passed the window, where the plane was now just another shape in the distance. Near the seating area, I paused and finally let myself feel it. Not tears. Not yet. Just a deep, steady ache in my chest. The kind that comes from being dismissed without a word. I checked the departure board one more time, even though I knew better. My name wasn't coming back. The screen didn't care. It never does. As I turned toward the main terminal, a thought settled in that scared me more than being stranded. If they could leave me like this, quietly, completely, then this wasn't about timing. It was about choice. And whatever came next would have to start with me accepting that. I took a breath, straightened my shoulders, and walked on. I kept walking, my shoes tapping against the polished floor, each step echoing a little too loudly in my ears. The terminal opened up in front of me, wide and busy, full of people who all seemed to know exactly where they were going. I didn't. Not anymore. I slowed down near a row of empty seats and lowered myself into one, careful, like my body was older than it had been just minutes ago. Anger arrived first. Not loud, not sharp. It came in waves, slow and warm, spreading through my chest. I felt it in my jaw, clenched without me realizing. I replayed the moment at the gate again, but this time with sharper edges. I thought about the way they'd looked at each other, the way no one had insisted on waiting, the way my phone stayed quiet. I imagined them settling into their seats, fastening their belts, choosing a movie, all while I stood staring at a screen that erased me, my hands curled into fists on my lap. I hated that part of myself, the part that wanted answers right now, that wanted to march back to the counter and demand something impossible. I didn't do it. Instead, I sat there and let the anger simmer, unsure what to do with it. Then came the shame. It crept in quietly, like it always does. A small voice in my head asked why I hadn't been faster, why I trusted anyone at all, why I hadn't insisted we stay together. I glanced around, suddenly aware of how I must look, an older woman sitting alone with a carry-on bag, and nowhere to go. I adjusted my sweater, smoothing it down as if that could hide what I was feeling. A couple sat nearby, sharing a bag of pretzels leaning close. I looked away. I didn't want to be seen as the woman left behind. I didn't want pity. I wanted to disappear into the crowd or rewind time 10 minutes. Neither was possible. I pulled out my phone again, not to call this time, but to check the time. Hours stretched ahead of me, empty and heavy. I opened my banking app, my stomach tightening as I scanned the numbers. Enough to manage, but not enough to be careless. I closed it quickly. One more thing to worry about. An announcement crackled overhead about a delayed flight to Denver. People groaned softly. I felt oddly disconnected from it all, like I was watching life through glass. My problem felt too personal to share the same space as missed connections and gate changes. I stood and wandered toward a quieter corner near a large window. Outside, planes moved in orderly lines, guided by lights and signals. I pressed my palm against the glass. It was cool, steady. I focused on that sensation, grounding myself. Breathe in, breathe out. My mother's voice floated up from memory, reminding me to slow down when my thoughts raced. I smiled faintly at that, then felt another sting. Even memories felt sharper now. I noticed a small cafe tucked between two shops and decided to get some water. The act of ordering felt strangely difficult, like I was pretending to be normal. The barista smiled and asked how my day was going. Fine, I said automatically, then corrected myself with a small shrug. Long, she nodded like she understood and handed me my cup. The simple kindness nearly undid me. I carried the water back to a table and took slow sips. Around me, conversations floated by. Vacation plans, work complaints, jokes about airport food. I wondered if I'd ever talk about this day casually, or if it would always sit heavier than that. My phone buzzed suddenly. My heart jumped, hope flaring before I could stop it. I checked the screen. A notification from a store app. Not them. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding and turned the phone face down. Silence settled in next. Not the peaceful kind. The kind that presses on your ears and makes your thoughts louder. I wanted someone to ask me what happened, but I also dreaded explaining it. How do you tell a stranger that the people you trusted chose convenience over you? I watched a family pass by, the mother counting heads, the father adjusting a backpack strap. They moved as a unit, slightly chaotic but together. I felt a tug of longing, then quickly pushed it away. Comparing wouldn't help. Time dragged. I checked the departure board again, scanning without purpose. I knew my flight was gone, but habits are hard to break. A maintenance cart rolled by, beeping softly. An older man dozed in his seat, newspaper folded on his chest. Life, relentless and ordinary. I decided to speak to the service desk, not because I expected miracles, but because doing nothing felt worse. The line was short. When it was my turn, I explained calmly that I'd missed my flight. I didn't mention the rest. The agent typed, asked a few questions, and offered options that involved long waits and extra fees. I listened, nodded, thanked her. I told her I needed a moment to decide. I stepped aside, leaning against a pillar. My reflection stared back at me from a nearby screen, tired eyes, tight mouth. I barely recognized myself. I thought about calling a friend, but stopped. I wasn't ready to hear sympathy. I needed to sit with this first, to understand it myself. A memory surfaced of a time years ago when I'd waited too long for someone who never showed up. Different place, same hollow feeling. I'd promised myself then that I wouldn't let it happen again. The thought stung. Promises, it seemed, were easy to break. I found a seat near an outlet and plugged in my phone, the small act feeling oddly comforting. I watched the battery icon climb, steady and predictable. I wished emotions worked the same way. As the hours passed, my anger cooled into something heavier. not forgiveness. Not yet. Something like resolve, though I didn't have a name for it. I realized that sitting here, replaying everything, wasn't going to change what happened, but it might change how I responded. I wrote a note to myself in my phone, not a message to anyone else. Just a few lines about how I felt, raw and unfiltered. It wasn't pretty, but it was honest. When I finished, I felt a little lighter, like I'd set something down. The terminal lights dimmed slightly as evening approached. Shadows stretched longer. The crowd thinned. I wrapped my arms around myself, feeling the chill. I wasn't sure what the night would bring, but I knew one thing: I was still here, still standing, still capable of choosing my next step, even if it was a small one. I took another breath, steadier this time, and looked around. The airport no longer felt like an enemy, just a place where something painful had happened. And places, I reminded myself, don't get the final say. I sat there between anger that hadn't fully left, shame that was slowly loosening its grip, and a silence that was beginning to feel less suffocating. In that space, uncomfortable as it was, I started to listen to my own thoughts, my own instincts. For the first time since the gate door closed, I felt the faintest sense of control returning. I didn't know what came next, but I knew this moment mattered, and I stayed with it, letting it shape me rather than break me. I was still sitting near the window, the faint hum of the airport around me, when I noticed him. At first, I barely registered his presence, just a figure slouched in one of the gray chairs across from me, an older man in a simple blazer, nothing flashy about him. But something about the way he watched me felt different. It wasn't curious or nosy. It wasn't the casual glance of someone scanning the room. It was careful, deliberate, quiet observation. He didn't approach immediately. He didn't interrupt. He simply adjusted his glasses, leaned back, and continued to watch. At first, I felt a prick of self-consciousness. Was he judging me? Did he see the tears I had barely contained, or the tight set of my shoulders as I tried to regain composure? I considered looking away, pretending I hadn't noticed him, but something inside me made me meet his gaze briefly. When our eyes met, he nodded just slightly, almost imperceptibly, and returned his attention elsewhere. I didn't understand it at the time, but it was reassuring, like he acknowledged my presence, my struggle, without needing me to explain it. That small recognition, that single nod, pulled me a fraction out of the spiral I had been sinking into. Minutes passed. I sipped my water, tried to lose myself in the reflection of the tarmac beyond the glass, but I kept noticing his subtle movements. The way he carefully folded the edge of his newspaper when he wasn't reading it, the occasional glance toward the gate, the small pen tucked behind his ear. Everything about him suggested a calm awareness, a life of habit, discipline. Yet it wasn't the type of discipline that screamed rigidity. It was measured, thoughtful, human. Finally, he spoke. Not loudly, not in a way that drew attention from anyone else. He leaned slightly forward and said, "Miss, are you traveling alone?" I blinked, startled. His voice was soft, but carried a quiet certainty that made it difficult to ignore. I hesitated, unsure if I wanted to respond. Strangers rarely asked, and when they did, it often came with unwanted assumptions. Yet there was something in the tone, something gentle, that made me feel safe enough to answer. "Yes," I said, finally, my voice low, careful. I missed my flight." He nodded, as if he already understood. "I saw," he said, not accusing, not judgmental, just factual, almost like an acknowledgement of reality I had been too stubborn to face on my own. I stared at him, surprised by how simple the words felt. Most people would have looked away, assumed I was just another traveler with a delay, but he noticed when others ignored. That realization made me feel lighter and heavier at the same time. Lighter because someone acknowledged my presence, heavier because it reminded me how unseen I had felt for so long. I I don't know what to do now. I admitted, letting my hands rest on my knees. Everything's gone wrong, and you'll figure it out, he interrupted softly, but firmly. I've learned over time that the first step isn't to fix things immediately. Sometimes it's just to see clearly what's happening. I blinked, unsure how to respond. Part of me wanted to argue, to insist that I didn't have the luxury of clarity right now, but the way he said it, steady and calm, made me pause. There was no condescension, no empty platitudes, just a quiet understanding, like someone who had experienced disappointment and learned something vital from it. We sat in silence after that, but the silence was no longer oppressive. It felt companionable, almost protective. I found myself observing him in return. He had a faint scar along his left hand, the kind you notice only if you pay attention. His shoes were polished, but simple, the soles worn slightly. He had a calmness in the way he sat, one that contrasted sharply with the jittery tension I'd carried for hours. Finally, he offered a small piece of advice. When people leave you behind, he said, don't rush to chase them. That's their plan. Sometimes the smarter move is to let them think they won. I swallowed hard, trying to digest the weight of that statement. It didn't feel like revenge in the traditional sense. There were no threats, no scheming, no desire for immediate retaliation. It felt strategic, measured, different from anything I had considered before. I looked away, focusing on the planes gliding across the tarmac. But what if they don't regret it? I asked quietly. What if they never do? Then it's their loss, not yours, he said simply, but you'll be ready when the moment comes. Something about his words stirred a curiosity I hadn't felt all day, a sense that, despite everything, I might not be powerless, that even in this humiliating, exhausting situation, there was a path forward, one I could walk on my own terms. I took a sip of water, trying to keep my thoughts from spinning too fast. I glanced back at him, curious now. Why are you helping me? I asked. He tilted his head slightly, with a small smile. I'm not helping you. Not really. I'm just noticing what others ignore. You're doing most of the work yourself. His honesty surprised me. There was no hidden agenda, no attempt to ingratiate or manipulate, just recognition, and a quiet, steady presence that made me feel less alone. For the first time that day, I realized that presence mattered more than solutions sometimes. I found myself talking more than I expected, recounting small details about the missed flight, about the moments leading up to the gate, about the silence I'd been holding inside. He listened without interruption, occasionally nodding, occasionally asking small, pointed questions that made me think deeper. When was the last time you trusted yourself before them? He asked at one point. His eyes held a softness that felt deliberate, almost like he was guiding me toward insight rather than telling me what to do. I paused, considering. It had been years, maybe decades. I had always measured myself through the expectations of others, family, friends, acquaintances, rarely through my own instincts. That recognition stung, but it also felt like a light flicking on after a long darkness. I don't know, I admitted finally. I suppose I've been following their lead for so long I forgot to notice my own path. He nodded again. Paths are easier to see when you're not chasing someone else's. Missed flights, abandoned moments. They teach clarity if you pay attention. A subtle shift happened in me then. It wasn't relief exactly. It wasn't even acceptance. It was a spark of agency, a sense that I could observe my situation rather than be consumed by it. The stranger hadn't fixed anything for me, but he had given me something I hadn't had all day, perspective. I looked out at the horizon beyond the windows. The planes glimmered in the early evening light, engines quieted for the night. And for the first time since I had been left behind, I felt a sliver of possibility. Not because someone else had come to save me, but because I could see myself in a new light, stronger, sharper, aware. As the terminal dimmed with the approach of evening, the stranger shifted slightly in his chair, stretching his hands over his knees. He glanced my way one last time and said softly, "Trust the process. Sit. Wait. Watch. The truth has a way of catching up." I nodded, a faint smile breaking across my face. "Thank you," I said, even though I wasn't sure if he needed it. He smiled back, that small, knowing curve of his lips. Then he returned to his own quiet observation, letting me sit in the space between action and patience. I realized that sometimes noticing alone could be the most profound kind of support. I stayed there for a long while, watching the planes, listening to the ambient hum of the terminal, and feeling a subtle shift in my heartbeat. I was still stranded. I was still abandoned. But the weight of that reality felt less like a chain and more like a test. And for the first time, I didn't feel powerless. The stranger remained a quiet presence in my periphery, a reminder that not everyone overlooked what was real. And as night settled in, I understood something vital. Attention, care, and patience, even from a stranger, could be a lifeline when your world suddenly felt unmoored. And in that realization, I began to see the first outline of a plan, not for confrontation, but for observation, for reclaiming the quiet power that had been stripped from me, for watching, waiting, and learning before anyone else even realized I was no longer helpless. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't flashy. It was subtle, careful, and deliberate, like the stranger himself. And somehow, that made all the difference. I sat in the corner of the terminal, my back pressed against the cold wall, watching life move past me like a slow, indifferent river. The stranger's words lingered. Sit, wait, watch. The truth has a way of catching up. I realized then that action didn't always mean rushing, speaking, or confronting. Sometimes the most powerful move was to remain still, silent, patient, and observant. And that day, for the first time, I understood the quiet, deliberate strength of doing nothing at all. I began with small observations. Each traveler, each gate announcement, each pause in the terminal chatter was a thread I could follow. My mind mapped the movement patterns of people, the subtle shifts in tone when staff spoke to different passengers, the hurried glances exchanged by couples who seemed too polished to be real. I noticed it all because I was no longer frantic. I was aware, almost painfully so. The first part of my self-imposed trap was psychological. By doing nothing, by allowing my absence from their lives to remain unchallenged, I began to let them expose themselves. I imagined the flight they were on, the comfort they took for granted, the small conveniences they would enjoy. And I also imagined the cracks, the way someone would complain, the way someone would flinch at a question, the little mistakes that always slip out when you think no one is watching. I stayed at the terminal for hours, alternating between watching the airport and watching my own thoughts. I began keeping a journal on my phone, noting patterns in behavior. Who ignored others, who pretended politeness while sneaking a glance at a phone, who made subtle attempts to manipulate their surroundings. I didn't write names at first, not yet. I wrote details, actions, and outcomes, knowing that the longer I observed, the more clarity I would gain. By mid-afternoon, I realized the trap was taking shape, not for them, but for me. I wasn't planning retaliation yet. I was quietly reclaiming control. I could let anger dictate my actions, or I could sit back, watch, and allow reality to unfold. There was power in restraint. I tasted it, subtle but intoxicating, and it sharpened my mind. A minor incident tested my patience. A man in a hurry bumped into my chair as he dragged his carry-on past me. His foot scraped my bag. I looked up, ready to snap, but the stranger's advice echoed in my mind. Sit, wait, watch. I exhaled slowly, adjusted my bag, and let him pass. He didn't apologize, didn't even notice my presence. And that, I realized, was the point. If I reacted, I would have given him, or anyone like him, the satisfaction of control. By remaining still, I held the power silently. The terminal began to thin out as evening approached. The once bustling crowd now moved with subdued efficiency. I noticed a family rushing past, a toddler tugging at a mother's hand, the father balancing a suitcase while trying to carry a coffee. They were entirely consumed by their own tasks, unaware of the small dramas unfolding around them. It struck me how often people miss what is most important because they're too preoccupied with appearances or convenience. That thought settled in, reinforcing the idea that I had chosen the right approach, observation over confrontation. At some point, I caught sight of my own reflection in the darkened terminal window. The woman staring back at me was tense but composed, her posture straighter than it had been hours before. I didn't look desperate anymore. There was a quiet resolve there, a subtle shift that even I could feel. The trap I was setting wasn't outward, it was inward. By doing nothing, by observing rather than reacting, I was reshaping how I interacted with the world. I took out a small notebook I had tucked into my purse, a physical backup to the notes on my phone. I began jotting observations in detail, times, behaviors, patterns, inconsistencies. It became a mental exercise in patience, precision, and restraint. Each note I made strengthened the sense that I was not powerless, that the day's betrayal could not define me. By the time the last flight boards were announced, I realized something remarkable. The people who had abandoned me were now a distant thought. I hadn't chased them. I hadn't called them in anger. I hadn't even cried. And because of that, I had gained clarity. Clarity on their character, clarity on my own boundaries, and clarity on how subtle, deliberate patience could turn a moment of humiliation into a tool for understanding and eventual empowerment. I noticed a small commotion near the information desk. A traveler was arguing about a lost ticket, his voice rising and drawing attention. The moment reminded me of what the stranger had said. Most people reveal themselves through reactions, not words. Observing without interference allowed the truth to surface, and I understood that my inaction was now a tool, a way to let those who hurt me expose their flaws while I remained grounded, unshaken. A young woman passed by, accidentally dropping a folder she had been carrying, papers scattered across the floor. I instinctively bent down to help, gathering them quietly, and handed them to her, without comment. She thanked me with a surprised smile, clearly expecting me to ignore the incident. That small interaction reinforced a truth I hadn't articulated before. Doing nothing didn't mean being passive in life. It meant being deliberate, intentional, and measured in where I invested energy. I spent hours like this, watching, noting, observing small human behaviors that most ignored. I realized I was learning more than I had in years. The airport, once a place of chaos and panic for me, became a laboratory of human character. Each glance, each conversation, each gesture was data, and I was quietly compiling it, preparing for a moment I knew would come when I had the clarity to act decisively. As night fell, the terminal lights dimmed, and the hum of distant planes grew softer. I felt a subtle sense of peace mixed with anticipation. The trap was not about revenge or confrontation. It was about allowing truth to reveal itself naturally while I strengthened my own position. Every moment of patience, every choice not to react impulsively, was a small victory in reclaiming control over a day that had begun with betrayal. I noticed a man attempting to cut ahead in the security line. He spoke loudly, gesturing and complaining, assuming his assertiveness would bend others to his will. I watched detached as people gently but firmly corrected him. He left the line frustrated, muttering, unaware that his behavior had revealed more than he intended. I smiled faintly. Observing from the sidelines allowed me to see human nature unfiltered, the same way my abandonment had exposed true characters without me saying a word. By the time I considered finding a place to rest for the night, I realized how much I had changed in mere hours. The trap I had set by doing nothing had transformed from a concept into a tangible skill, the ability to observe without interference, to understand without immediate judgment, to reclaim dignity quietly. I no longer felt stranded. I felt present, attentive, calculating, not in a cold or manipulative way, but in a way that honored my own resilience and intelligence. Eventually, I found a quiet bench near a rarely used boarding gate and settled down, my belongings neatly arranged around me. The hum of the terminal, the distant laughter of a few late-night travelers, the occasional rolling suitcase, they were no longer overwhelming. They were part of the environment I was mastering, part of the observation that reinforced my new clarity. I thought about what had begun as humiliation, anger, and shame, and I realized that the choice to do nothing had given me something I had not expected: perspective. Power did not always need to be exerted through confrontation. Sometimes it was gathered quietly, silently, as the world moved around you. Sometimes the act of restraint itself was the strongest statement. Hours passed, and sleep became a distant possibility. I didn't mind. I watched. I noted. I reflected. Every small human action became a lesson. Every minor mistake a demonstration of what impatience or entitlement looks like. And in that moment, I felt my power returning piece by piece, not through loud statements or dramatic gestures, but through observation, patience, and deliberate choice. As the terminal slowly emptied, I understood the truth. The trap I had set was working, not for anyone else, not even for them. It was for me. It was a test of my own restraint, my own intelligence, and my ability to stand still while the world rushed past. And standing still had never felt so alive. I leaned back against the bench, my shoulders finally loosening after hours of tense stillness. The terminal was nearly empty now. The bright hum of fluorescent lights softened to a gentle glow. Only a handful of travelers moved between gates, each lost in their own quiet routines. I felt the weight of the day pressing against me, but it was different now. It was no longer a weight meant to crush me. It was a reminder of everything I had endured, observed, and survived. For the first time, I allowed myself to look at the events from earlier with calm detachment. The sting of abandonment no longer felt like fire ripping through me. It was a dull, firm ache, a marker of reality, yes, but one I could now control. I realized that being left behind hadn't made me weak. It had forced me to see clearly, to pay attention, to reclaim my own boundaries. And that reclamation felt more valuable than any frantic chase after vindication ever could. I glanced down at my bag, neatly packed beside me. Everything I had with me, my essentials, my phone, my notebook, the few items that kept me grounded, reminded me that I had survived without anyone else. I had navigated the airport, absorbed information, controlled my emotions, and observed the world without collapsing under fear or shame. That, I thought, was a quiet triumph. As I watched a janitor sweep near Gate 14, I reflected on the subtle lessons of observation I had learned. People often reveal their true selves through small, unconscious behaviors. A hurried glance, a frown when something doesn't go their way, the little ways they try to dominate space without thinking. I had spent the day watching and recording these patterns, and in doing so, I had learned more than I expected. The abandonment had been a brutal teacher, but it was also a precise one. I felt a sudden shift when the door to the terminal opened and a cool evening breeze drifted in. The smell of distant rain mixed with jet fuel, carrying the faint scent of wet pavement from outside. I inhaled slowly, letting it settle in my lungs. Each breath felt like a small affirmation. I was here. I was whole. I was capable. A family passed by, the father holding a stroller while the mother adjusted a toddler's coat. The toddler laughed and ran ahead, tumbling slightly but catching himself with a quick grip on the railing. I smiled softly. There was simplicity in that scene I hadn't noticed before, the resilience of ordinary people, the instinct to move forward even after small falls. I recognized myself in that child, in that moment, rising after a tumble I had thought might break me. I took out my notebook again and reviewed the notes I had taken throughout the day. Names weren't recorded, only behaviors, gestures, inconsistencies. Each note reminded me that I had documented truth without confrontation, that I had captured reality while remaining calm. That in itself was a kind of power I hadn't acknowledged before. The people who had abandoned me might have assumed they had won, but I had quietly reclaimed my control. A gate announcement crackled softly. Flight 438 to Chicago. Final boarding call. Most travelers rose and began moving toward their gates. I stayed seated, letting the energy of motion wash past me without participating. I had no flight to chase, no one to impress, no urgency to react. For the first time, I felt fully untethered from their narrative. I was no longer a participant in their decisions. I was an observer of my own life. An elderly couple approached the seating area and paused near my bench. The man offered a polite nod, and the woman smiled kindly. They sat down a few chairs away, quietly conversing in hushed tones. Watching them, I realized how much I had underestimated the power of quiet presence. Sometimes strength doesn't announce itself with noise. Sometimes it manifests as calm, resilience, and steady observation. I allowed myself a small laugh at the memory of my earlier panic, the frantic calls, the repeated glances at the gate screen. It had all felt like the end of the world, but now it seemed almost surreal. How quickly fear can dominate perception, I thought. How easily we assume the worst until perspective slowly creeps in. And in that creeping perspective, I had discovered my own strength. A teenager rushed past, dragging a suitcase that had clearly seen better days. He collided lightly with my bag, muttered a distracted apology, and kept moving. Normally, I would have bristled at the intrusion. Today, I simply adjusted my bag, letting him pass. I realized that my patience had become part of my strength. Choosing when to react and when to let go was part of the quiet mastery I had begun cultivating. I pulled my sweater tighter around my shoulders as a draft from the sliding doors passed through the terminal. I felt exposed yet grounded, like the chill was a tangible reminder that I was still alive, still aware, still capable of making choices without surrendering to fear or shame. I had entered this airport feeling invisible, powerless, and abandoned. Now, I felt the opposite. I was present. I was intentional. I was strong. My phone buzzed. I almost ignored it, but curiosity won. A message from a colleague, unrelated to the flight or the abandonment. "Are you okay? Missed your call." I stared at the screen, considering my reply. Part of me wanted to vent, to explain, to demand sympathy. Instead, I typed a brief, polite response. "I'm okay. Just needed some time to think." I hit send, feeling the subtle satisfaction of restraint. Not every emotional impulse needed release. Not every slight required immediate attention. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the background hum of the terminal fill me. It was no longer oppressive. It was rhythmic grounding. I could hear the faint sounds of rolling luggage, distant announcements, murmured conversations. Each noise reminded me that life moved forward, and so could I. I no longer needed anyone else's validation to mark my progress. A sudden, unexpected act caught my attention. A man had dropped his boarding pass near the counter, too flustered to notice. Without thinking, I retrieved it and handed it to him. He thanked me with a surprised, almost disbelieving expression. That small, inconsequential gesture reminded me that strength also lay in kindness. I didn't have to sacrifice integrity or empathy in reclaiming my power. I could act decisively and thoughtfully at the same time. The night deepened and the terminal lights dimmed. The stranger from earlier had long since left, but his presence lingered in memory. His simple advice, to watch, wait, and trust the process, had become a guiding principle. I realized that part of walking away stronger was internalizing that guidance without depending on it. Strength wasn't given. It was cultivated in quiet moments of decision and observation. I rose from my bench slowly, stretching muscles stiff from hours of sitting. My steps felt deliberate, measured, confident. I walked toward the exit, each movement a conscious affirmation of the day's lessons. I didn't need to look back at the gate or imagine the reactions of those who had abandoned me. Their choices no longer dictated my emotions or my path. Outside, the night air was cool and crisp. I inhaled deeply, savoring the sharp contrast to the stale warmth of the terminal. The city beyond the airport stretched in lights and shadows, a vast, unknowable expanse. And yet, I didn't feel small or lost. I felt expansive, capable, aware of my own strength. I walked toward the parking area, my pace steady. The sound of distant traffic, the occasional honk, the murmur of late-night travelers. It all felt like a symphony of ordinary life, grounding me in the present. For hours, I had been stranded, abandoned, tested, and observed. Now, I was walking away with the certainty that I had passed each test, even if no one else knew. As I reached the lot, I paused to look back at the airport terminal. Lights glowed, faintly behind the glass, the last travelers moving like shadows in the distance. A smile touched my lips, small but genuine. I was leaving not with bitterness, not with rage, but with clarity and resilience. I had transformed humiliation into insight, abandonment into strength. I had walked away stronger than I arrived. In that moment, I understood the final, subtle truth of the day. Power doesn't always come from confrontation. Sometimes it emerges from patience, observation, and the quiet reclaiming of oneself. The people who left me behind had no idea what they had set in motion. They had assumed weakness. They had assumed passivity. And yet, in their absence, I had built something far stronger, a version of myself capable of moving forward without fear, without attachment, and without compromise of dignity. The car I had parked outside waited patiently, unassuming like the rest of the world. I slid into the seat and closed the door, the cool interior greeting me. I started the engine, feeling the gentle rumble beneath me. Each mile I drove away from the airport, each turn and stoplight reinforced a simple, undeniable fact. I had survived, I had learned, and I had grown. I had been left behind, but I was leaving with more than I had arrived with. Even as the city lights blurred past, I thought of the stranger's words again, and I smiled. Trust the process. Sit. Wait. Watch. I had trusted it. I had waited. I had watched. And now, walking into the unknown night, I carried with me a quiet, unstoppable strength, a strength born not from revenge or vindication, but from the simple, profound act of surviving and observing, fully awake and fully myself. I didn't look back again. The airport, the abandonment, the betrayal, they were all behind me. Ahead lay possibility, choice, and the steady certainty that no one could define my worth but me. And for the first time in hours, maybe even years, I felt free. I drove through the quiet streets, the city lights flickering like tiny promises of a life I hadn't yet lived. The hum of the engine beneath me was steady, comforting, almost like a heartbeat syncing with my own. I realized with a weightless clarity that the day's chaos, the abandonment, the humiliation, the endless waiting hadn't broken me. It had refined me. Each sharp edge of betrayal had sharpened my instincts. Every pang of anger had taught me patience. Every quiet, unnoticed moment in the terminal had strengthened my sense of self. I thought about the people who had left me behind, the ones who assumed that I would crumble, that I would call, chase, beg, or cry. They had no idea. They had no clue that leaving me in that cold, fluorescent-lit space had done the exact opposite of what they intended. Instead of fear, I found focus. Instead of panic, I discovered clarity. Instead of powerlessness, I unearthed a quiet, unshakable strength that no apology, no recognition, and no confrontation could grant me. I thought about the stranger who had noticed me when everyone else ignored my presence, the man who didn't intervene, didn't offer pity, didn't instruct or lecture, but simply acknowledged that I existed, that I was struggling and aware. That small act of recognition, a fleeting nod, had reminded me that sometimes the world doesn't need to bend to your will for you to reclaim your power. Sometimes the act of watching, of understanding, of moving deliberately through silence is the most potent strategy of all. And I had followed it. I had waited. I had observed. I had learned. And now, finally, I could move forward without the noise of their choices echoing in my mind. I thought about how fragile appearances are, how easily people assume control over someone else's reality, and how fleeting power can be when it is based on convenience, deception, or neglect. I thought about my own resilience, my own capacity to endure, and I felt a warmth spread through me that wasn't pride or vindication. It was something quieter, deeper. It was freedom. Freedom from the need to explain myself. Freedom from the need to beg for attention or validation. Freedom from the belief that someone else's choices could define my worth. I had arrived at the airport feeling invisible, small, abandoned. I was leaving with my eyes wide open, my mind alert, and my heart steady. Every moment of pain had been a lesson. Every moment of waiting had been preparation. And now I carried all of it with me, not as a burden, but as armor. I drove on, the city sprawling around me like a landscape of possibilities, each turn a reminder that I was no longer tethered to anyone else's story. I didn't need closure, confrontation, or revenge. I had something far more profound, the knowledge that I could stand alone, unshaken, and still move forward with dignity. And as I pulled onto the open highway, the cool wind brushing against the windows, I whispered softly to myself, almost like a vow, I am stronger than I have ever been. I am enough. I am awake. And no one will ever leave me behind again, not literally, not emotionally, not spiritually.